You know, over the last few days, I've been watching the news, just like many of you probably have. Headlines flash across the screen one after another. A new name appears, a new face, a new supreme leader in Iran. Most people see that headline, maybe skim the first sentence, and then go on with the rest of their day. And I understand why. Life is busy. There's always another story, another crisis, another distraction competing for our attention. But I want to ask you to stay with me for a moment on this one, because what happened on March 8th, 2026 is not just another headline drifting past the news cycle. This is the kind of moment that quietly changes the landscape of international politics. I've seen a few moments like that in my lifetime. At first, the world barely notices them. The tremor is subtle, but later we realize the ground had shifted beneath our feet the whole time. The name is Mojtaba Khamenei. For most Americans, it's probably unfamiliar. Few people here have ever heard it spoken before, and yet today he occupies one of the most powerful positions on earth, Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. That means commander of the country's armed forces, overseer of the state, and ultimately the final authority over Iran's nuclear program. But there's something unusual about this development that you need to understand. Mojtaba Khamenei is not an Ayatollah. In fact, by the theological standards written into Iran's own constitution, he does not even meet the religious qualifications normally required for the role. That detail may sound technical, but it matters far more than, and most people realize. I spent 8 years sitting in the Oval Office, watching leadership change around the world. I watched transitions of power in Moscow, Beijing, and Baghdad, and over time you learn something important about global politics. The most dangerous moments are not always when a powerful leader acts boldly. Sometimes the real danger appears when leadership suddenly passes to someone new, especially under conditions of crisis, anger, or grief. That is the situation we are facing tonight. A man who has just lost members of his family in the same strike that killed his father. A man who now commands one of the most powerful military structures in the Middle East. Analysts are already calling him the most unpredictable figure to take that position in more than 4 decades, and most people around the world still have no idea what that could mean. To understand what might happen next, and we first need to understand how we arrived here. The timeline matters. On February 28, 2026, a joint military operation carried out by the United States and Israel struck targets in Tehran. According to reports, the entire strike lasted barely a minute. In that short window of time, Ayatollah Said Ali Khamenei, who had ruled Iran for nearly 40 years and was killed at the age of 86. Several members of his family died in the same attack. Iran confirmed his death the following day. What happened next was extraordinary. Under Iran's constitution, the next supreme leader is chosen by the Assembly of Experts, an 88-member clerical council tasked with selecting the country's highest authority. Normally, that body meets in person to debate candidates, but this time, many of their offices had been damaged by the bombing, so the deliberations happened remotely. While those discussions were taking place, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, reportedly began applying immense pressure behind the scenes, phone calls, personal visits, direct warnings. The message was clear. They wanted one specific candidate, Mojtaba Khamenei. Several members of the assembly resisted. 8 of them attempted to boycott the process entirely. Their concern was simple but profound. What they were witnessing looked less like a religious appointment and more like a hereditary transfer of power, a dynasty emerging inside a system that was never supposed to allow one. Meanwhile, events outside Iran added another layer of tension. On March 5th, President Donald Trump publicly commented on the situation. He described Mojtaba as a lightweight and suggested that the United States should have a role in the selection of Iran's next leader. Now, I understand the instinct behind statements like that. When you hold the presidency, you want to project strength. You want to show that America still shapes global events, but there's a basic rule in international politics. Nations do not publicly claim the authority to choose another country's leader. Once you say something like that out loud, you give every rival government in the world a rhetorical weapon they can use against you. And here's another important detail. The Assembly of Experts itself isn't exactly a democratic institution either. Candidates who run for that body are vetted by Iran's Guardian Council, which is itself appointed by the supreme leader. In other words, the system ultimately selects its own successors. So what happened in early March wasn't a transparent transition. It was a closed political structure choosing continuity under intense pressure from the military while the country was still absorbing the shock of an attack. That's not a normal leadership transition. That's a wartime succession. Now let's talk about the man at the center of it all. Mojtaba Khamenei was born in 1969 in the city of Mashhad. He was the second son of Ali Khamenei. During the Iranian Yersdanen Durdunj Iranian Revolution, he was still a child, but by the time he reached his teenage years, Iran was already locked in the brutal Iran-Iraq War. At just 17 years old, he reportedly joined the war effort with a Revolutionary Guard unit. Those years mattered. The friendships and alliances forged in wartime often shaped political power decades later. Many of the men who fought alongside him eventually rose through the ranks of the IRGC. After the war ended, Mojtaba studied religious theology in the city of Qom under several hardline clerics. But here's the key point. His religious rank remains relatively modest. He holds the title Hojat al-Islam, a mid-level clerical designation. He is not an Ayatollah and lacks the authority traditionally expected of someone who would lead Iran's religious establishment. His influence has always come from somewhere else. For decades, he worked inside his father's office as a political operator and gatekeeper. Since the late 1990s, he reportedly served as a key advisor and power broker behind the scenes. During the protests that followed Iran's 2009 election of the so-called Green Movement, many analysts believe Mojtaba played a role in coordinating the security response through the Basiji paramilitary force. Financial investigations have also suggested that he controls extensive wealth through international investments and complex business networks. The United States Treasury sanctioned him in 2019, describing him as someone who effectively exercised authority similar to the supreme leader even before holding the title. Observers across multiple policy institutions describe him as closely aligned with the most hardline factions within Iran's system. And now consider one more factor that shapes this moment. Members of his immediate family were killed in the same strike that created the leadership vacancy he now fills. This is a man holding enormous power while experiencing personal grief and anger. That combination can be extremely volatile in global politics. Whenever a new leader rises to power, the world watches closely to see what their first moves will be. Will they reach out to allies, seek internal consensus, attempt diplomatic engagement? So far, Mojtaba's early signals point in a different direction. Reports suggest he is focused primarily on strengthening ties with the Revolutionary Guard. Security forces appear to be expanding their authority inside the government, and there are indications of loyalty purges within certain institutions. rather than easing tensions. The early posture appears focused on consolidation and control. That approach carries risks. History shows that governments relying heavily on security forces to maintain authority often create internal pressure over time. The appearance of stability can hide deeper instability underneath. Then there's the nuclear question. Some analysts believe Mojtaba may push Iran's nuclear program forward at an accelerated pace. His father had maintained a religious ruling opposing nuclear weapons, whether symbolic or sincere. It created space for diplomatic negotiations. Mojtaba lacks both the authority and the incentive to maintain that position. For the Revolutionary Guard, nuclear capability would provide the ultimate deterrent, and the regional environment surrounding Iran has become more volatile than ever. Missile exchanges with Israel, tensions along Gulf shipping lanes, and the mobilization of regional proxy groups have already increased the risk of wider conflict. But beyond the regional consequences, there is another dimension that Americans must consider. The strike that killed Ali Khamenei was conducted without formal congressional authorization. Regardless of how one views Iran's leadership, the constitutional framework of the United States requires that major acts of war involve the legislative branch. That principle exists for a reason. It prevents power from becoming concentrated in a single office. And when that process is bypassed, it raises serious questions about accountability. Now I want to step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. The Islamic Republic was originally built on the idea that leadership should come from religious scholarship, not inheritance. The doctrine of guardianship of the jurist assumed that the most learned religious authority would lead the state. A hereditary succession contradicts that premise. For many observers, Mojtaba's rise represents a fundamental shift in the identity of the regime itself. The ripple effects could extend across the broader Shia world as well. Many senior religious figures are aging, and the clerical hierarchy is entering a generational transition. In that kind of environment, power struggles become more likely, and instability in a country with Iran's strategic position and military capabilities has global consequences. So where does this leave us? There are several possible paths forward. One possibility is consolidation. Mojtaba secures control with support from the Revolutionary Guard, strengthens the security state, and accelerates nuclear development. Another possibility is internal division. Clerics, political factions, and military leaders could begin competing for influence, creating fractures inside the system. A third possibility involves external escalation. Regional conflict could intensify as Iran seeks to reassert deterrence after the strike that killed its previous leader. And finally, there remains the difficult but necessary option of diplomacy. History shows that dialogue between adversaries, even during the Cold War, can prevent crises from spiraling into catastrophe. None of these outcomes are predetermined, but each requires careful strategy, cooperation with allies, and respect for the legal frameworks that guide international conduct. Let me finish with this thought. Democracy survives not because it is inevitable, but because citizens insist on protecting it. Systems where power passes from father to son, where dissent is suppressed and institutions answer to no one, those are systems that America has spent centuries trying to avoid. The events unfolding in Iran should remind us how fragile political systems can become when accountability disappears. So if I could ask Americans for three things tonight, it would be this. First, defend the institutions that protect constitutional authority. Congress must exercise its role in decisions about war and peace. Second, remember the Iranian people themselves. Tens of millions of ordinary citizens did not choose this leadership struggle and should not be confused with the actions of their government. And third, keep a sense of perspective and hope. Throughout history, the United States has faced moments of uncertainty before, and And each time, we found a way to correct course. The choices we make now will help determine what comes next, and those choices begin with paying attention.